Okay, thank you. Thank you, Raquel, and thank you for the kind words for Drug Policy Alliance and Transnational Institute before about Uruguay. So how many of you were here for the morning legal session? Just raise your hands. Okay, so I should say that my comments that I'm going to make now, I didn't know what I was going to say when I arrived in Ibiza yesterday, and I'm developing my thoughts as I speak with people and listen to people yesterday and today. And I'll apologize if tomorrow at the 6 o'clock session I repeat some of the things that were said here, but hopefully it'll be informed tomorrow by further conversations. So I just want to focus on a few, how much time do I have? 15 minutes. Okay, so I just want to focus on, I want to focus first on the issue that was discussed a lot this morning was the issue of cognitive liberty. Right, and it came up in Jonas's comments and in Charlotte's comments and others. Roy was speaking about it before as well. And there were the issues about, does cognitive liberty extend to less elevated uses of drugs? Somebody asked, should it, I can't remember if that person's here now, should it just apply to ayahuasca or maybe not other drugs? Should there be some standards and all this sort of stuff? And I think, and I like the way Jonas pulled up the stuff at the beginning, pulling from Richard Glenbois, who has writing I think is wonderful about this stuff, about cognitive liberty. It seems to me that cognitive liberty, as with most other basic liberties, needs to extend not just to ayahuasca and other psychedelics, but across all drugs. Right? That's what it's about. When we talk about the basic freedom over one's consciousness, and when Charlotte makes the point, it's not just about religious or just spiritual or whatever it might be, right? It has to go more broadly, and it's not just about the good. It's also, to some extent, about our cognitive liberty to take those substances in our body, which may destroy us. And those very difficult questions about at what point do we empower the state to get between us, our mouths, our brains, and our ability to destroy ourselves, right? I mean, that's sort of the fundamental question here. And I say this obviously as a civil libertarian or a believer in the human rights elements of drugs, but that's what it comes down to. Sometimes in the United States, when I go sort of more radical in my speeches about drug policy reform, the way I'll frame it is I'll say, mostly to fellow Americans, one of the greatest things about my country is the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, right? The prohibition on restrictions on the freedom of speech, press, religion, and assembly. Right, and in some respects, that's in some respect one of the key elements that has kept the United States honest, that's prevented us from ever fully descending into something resembling a real dictatorship over our entire 200 plus years of history, being the longest continuous democracy, even with all our failings and flaws. But that Bill of Rights stands up big there, and that First Amendment is particularly important. Right? Now, what we know is the freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly have been pivotal. In the United States, they're given actually quite a bit more room than you have in many other countries. I look at European countries where people, am I speaking too quickly for anybody? Let me slow down. You know what it was? I was talking about speaking to Americans, and I naturally sped up in that context. You look at some of the things I think that Ben put up on his slide this morning about in Belgium or in France or maybe even the UK, right? I mean, Charlotte put that up, about the people being punished even for talking about the use of these substances, that somehow that's advocacy and you can be punished by the state even for speaking about it, even in the absence of the presence of this substance, right? But that basic element, right, of freedom of speech, part of the other analogy that Richard Boyer and Jonas made was that if you look at the old religious prohibitions, right, what was the great fear? One of the great fears of allowing people to pray to their own gods was that might mean the end of not just the power of the religious hierarchy, but the end of civilization as we knew it. The fear about allowing freedom of the press, the fear of the printing press, was once again not just about the loss of control by those small numbers of people who control the flow of information, but some fear about what would actually happen to society if we allowed the masses to access whatever they wanted to read or to do. Same thing with assembly, press, etc. Right? And so in that same sense, what we're talking about now is the fears, the very, very, very deep-seated fear. When you ask, what is the fear, not just about ayahuasca, because that's a lesser fear, but the fear about broader legalization, of legalizing all drugs the way that alcohol and tobacco are, or even something far short of that. The fear, of course, is that to do so would lead to a sort of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? A society that was just going to come apart at the seams and all sorts of horrible things. Those fears are remarkably similar to the fears that not just the elites and the powerful, but many others had about the fear of allowing people to speak their mind, to write their mind, to pray to the God of their own choosing, right? It's a fundamental similarity. And to some extent, you know, the challenge is how do we reassure those who are fearful, the reasonable people who are fearful, that in fact this fear is so much like theirs. Now, I said before, when I go radical in the United States, what I'll say is those fundamental freedoms in the First Amendment of speech, press, religion, and assembly, underlying all of those freedoms is a presumption, a presumptive freedom that our founders, the founders of the American Republic, took for granted, which was freedom of consciousness. They did not imagine that somehow we could constrain people's consciousness. They didn't think in those terms. That the freedom of speech, press, religion, and assembly ultimately, to some extent, is diminished or even made meaningless if one does not allow for that freedom of consciousness, right? And so that fundamental notion that to the extent that we're talking about psychoactive substances as ways of shaping our consciousness, that is inherent to those, it is the underlying core or root of the freedoms that we accept as part of an open society in our modern world of speech. Did that all make sense, basically? The flip side of that, of course, also is something we have not talked about, which is the flip side of allowing people the freedom to take these substances into our bodies to alter our consciousness, is also the requirement that the state cannot require us to take substances into our body, right? It's that other part of our world that oftentimes doesn't intersect about the situations where people are compelled to take drugs because of their mental illness, whether it is mental illness as defined by doctors or mental illness as defined by state-sanctioned doctors, right? Or whether it is to enable people to serve trial. So there's a flip side to this about the right or freedom not to take drugs that might be imposed on us. The second thing I would say about this is that when we were looking for analogies around cognitive liberty, and people were talking about religion, but at least in my country and many others, I think, the other way we think about it is not just over the sovereignty over one's mind, but sovereignty over one's body, right? And of course, that false dichotomy between the two. But in a way, for us, the leading arm of the pushing element right now is what's happened in the last generation with the transformation in public consciousness and law around homosexuality and sexual, not just identity, but sexual activity, right? That notion that what you put into your body is your own business in the sexual realm, and the acceptance of that in a way that was unimaginable just a generation ago, that too carries an analogy, you know, for the way that for the arguments that we may use when we think about, when Roy tries to imagine how do we build the cases, how do we do, you know, in the United States, when we had our breakthrough civil rights decision in 1954 saying that segregating schools of black and white was no longer acceptable. But that was based upon 20 years of strategic litigation, bit by bit, sort of pulling away, first to discard the discrimination against black people going to graduate school, and then in other areas where it was so evidently absurd, and then just keep going up to other levels where people could accept it. When we think about how we construct a generational litigation strategy so that one day our U.S. Supreme Court or other courts around the world could find for the right of the cognitive liberty involving ayahuasca or other substances, or not just the psychedelics, the analogy that most comes to mind for us is the one over sexual identity. That was the one that it was about not just here, but your body. You know, I should say that some of you will see, if you look in your book and on a few pages in, we have here the Drug Policy Alliance vision statement. And we say the Drug Policy Alliance envisions a just society in which the use and regulation of drugs are grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights, in which people are no longer punished for what they put into their own bodies, but only for crimes committed against others, and in which the fears, prejudices, and punitive prohibitions of today are no more. And in our mission statement, we specifically refer to sovereignty over mind and body. A couple of years ago, I went to see a congressman in the United States, Barney Frank. And Barney Frank was the first congressman to publicly say he was gay. And he was also an ally on the issue of drug reform, and especially marijuana reform. And as I was leaving, I said to him, you know, Barney, gay rights, marijuana legal reform, it's all about the same principle. And he looks at me. And I say, yeah, that nobody should be punished for what they put in their body, absent harm to others, whether it's a cock or a joint. He looked at me, he got it, right? But that's, to some extent, I think, the analogy that will maybe most valuable for us in our advocacy efforts around cognitive liberty, about bodily liberty. Now, let me switch from this subject of cognitive liberty and just go to this issue of what's going on now with marijuana and its implications. And I won't have great answers here. This is more the dilemmas I'm sharing with you that I'm dealing with right now. The first one is this. What happened in Colorado and Washington with the legalization of marijuana, and then that happened in November of 2012, and then last year, 13 months ago, when the White House, the Obama White House, and the Justice Department basically provided a set of guidelines and said to the states of Colorado and Washington, we will allow you to implement the state legalization and regulation law over marijuana, and here are the criteria. Notwithstanding the fact that what the voters of Colorado and Washington just did is in violation of our federal law, that was a remarkable breakthrough. When people want to criticize Obama, and he deserves lots of criticism, I have to say, he may not have provided leadership in the bold sense of the word on this marijuana issue, but in point of fact, he did something that was remarkable. Because when he did that, it not just opened up the gates for other states to do the same thing. It not just opened up, not only, it also put forward a suggestion that perhaps that the federal drug law in the United States is called the 1970 Controlled Substances Act. If you look at it, if you dust it off and read it, it's about drug control in the interest of public safety and health. And there was language in what our Attorney General, Holder, said in the statement that perhaps Washington and Colorado can better accomplish the health and safety objectives of federal drug control through a responsible regulation of cannabis than by persisting with the obviously failed prohibitionist policies of the past. So they opened up, they planted the seeds for a new way of imagining, of understanding our federal drug law. Once they did that for Colorado and Washington, they had to accord the same privilege to other governments. My government has been the driving force for the global drug war for almost 100 years. You know, it's just the last couple years where the Russians have seized the baton from us, but we really led it for much of the last century. But at this point now, they begin to say to Uruguay, the U.S. ambassador said this in December, what you're doing is in fact none of our business. So long as you're not shipping your weed to America or creating major problems, marijuana now lies outside. And it also meant that after for decades insisting on a conservative, orthodox, homogeneous interpretation of the International Anti-Drug Control Conventions, all of a sudden, a few months ago, the head of the State Department's Narcotics Bureau, Brownfield, a very sophisticated diplomat, says the United States now supports an approach of flexibility in the interpretation of the conventions. Flexibility from my government on the drug conventions? That's like a revolution. Because what it does is it opens up possibilities. Before, when other countries would do heroin maintenance programs or supervised injection facilities or something, the U.S. government would routinely say no, right? But now, hey, we're flexible now. And that means that if one government wants to allow, if Peru wants to do this with ayahuasca and somebody else with that, and now meanwhile New Zealand has set up a regulatory system to allow new synthetic drugs to be approved through an FDA-like process if they can establish their safety levels, that's a new system. It means that the U.S. government, still the most powerful force in international drug control, is not going to be the opponent it was. The final comment I'll make here, you know, people were talking this morning, regulation. Should people get a license to be able to do psychedelics or be granted a license that you then have the power to lose? What about education? What's the role of the state? Maybe we should just leave things the way they are, right? Somebody in the audience saying, listen, I'm running my sessions, my ayahuasca sessions, it's okay, it's not a problem. And then somebody else saying, are you kidding me? I operate in secrecy and fear. I don't know who I'm dealing with. I can't do this, I can't do that. I can't, you know, the lack of information, all of these things. So we have this continuum of options, right? From over in this end, a highly punitive system of criminalization, to, in the middle, a system of regulation, decriminalization, what have you, right? And over here, a possibly regulated but more commercialized system. The dilemma I'm dealing with in the United States right now is that we don't know how to do in the middle. We either prohibit the hell out of it, lock you up for a long time, demonize, stigmatize, you know, your brain on eggs type anti-drug education, or hey, 24/7, you know, I mean, like we went with gambling prohibition to casinos open 24/7, let the liquor flow, have states do lotteries, design advertisements specifically appealing to compulsive, addictive personalities because there's more profit there. I mean, so we don't do the middle sensible well. You know, we tend to hope and look at Europe maybe for a model. I was talking to Amber. Is Amber here from the UK, who's in Spain now, looking at the hundreds of cannabis shops popping up in this country, or should I say in Catalonia, in the Basque area, right? And you know, in this in-between ground, that's sort of in between, but maybe not so in between, right? And the issue of there's lots of illegal money being made, and maybe some people getting killed and hurt, and maybe some people going to prison. And so when we think about, you know, the struggle I have right now is we're going to try to legalize marijuana in California in 2016. We have to win next month in Oregon and Alaska, but California is going to be the big one, because if California legalizes, like Mexico, the rest of Latin America is all going to go through an existential crisis on their drug wars. I mean, it's part of the appeal of it. But the problem is tens of thousands of people in California are now making a decent living growing marijuana, selling it through the back door of the cannabis dispensaries, right? A lot of them are not getting rich. There's some violence, there's some this, there's some that. And meanwhile, I'm meeting the new players in the marijuana industry, brand new. coming from real estate, coming from, you name it, coming from, you know, and they don't give a damn about these principles. And so I'm fighting for this because of civil rights and civil liberties, but the ones who are going to take it over in a few years are the large-scale commercial ones and the people who have struggled to make a living. And I have a serious ethical and political dilemma at this time about that. With respect to ayahuasca, there are no perfect scenarios. There are perfect moments when you get in the middle of having a prohibition that is so benign, it keeps what is good without throwing on what is bad. But ultimately, we see the horrors of prohibition with the people who live in fear and incarcerated. We imagine sensible regulation, but how many governments actually regulate sensibly? I mean, they're human beings. They're full of prejudices and stupidity and competition. They do so many stupid things. I mean, especially in my country, but I don't think we're unique in that regard. Meanwhile, we have a law enforcement lobby, a prison industrial complex in my country, very powerful, but we'll replace it with something which is somewhat more benign, but it's going to be the power of big pharma or the power of big corporate interests. So in the end, what we're looking for, I think, is there is no nirvana here. It is about coming up with the least bad way of living and dealing with this in our society. There will be no perfect. Even the sensible, decriminalized, you know, regulated thing is going to be state authorities, all this stuff. But that's the sweet spot we need to aim for. Thanks.